Joined now by Jess Settles, former Iowa Hawkeye, current BTN analyst, and one of the most knowledgeable analysts out there on places where he didn't play. I mean, and he's rocking the John Deere hat on top of that. So, boom, he wins. He wins for the day. How's it going, man?
Hey, I'm doing well. I appreciate the shout out on the John Deere hat. My dad and I, we farm in Southeast Iowa, so we farm corn and soybeans. That's all we drive are John Deere. So the BTN stuff is just a side hustle in the winter, and it works out with the schedule. But that's what we do. But hey, man, it was great to be in Indiana the other day. I love it. Hoosier basketball. I always get excited when I get an opportunity to call a game there and just be in Assembly Hall. There's just nothing like it, as you guys know.
Man, the fact that you're an actual farmer, I did not know that, A.
Yeah.
B, that's incredible. That's awesome that you get to do it with your dad.
Right.
Even it just continues to go on and on. But and that's not an easy gig, brother. That's the getting up early kind of jobs.
Man, it's just great to be outside. I'm farming with my dad, my uncle Gary. It's wonderful. The ag community, as you guys know, is just a unique group of people. I always tell people that the toughest part about farming is marketing your grain. It's like, you grow it and you harvest it, and it's just a blast, and your kids are involved, and your mom and your wife and your kids bring dinner out to the tractor or the combine. It's just the greatest feeling in the world. But at the end of the day, it's just timing the markets of selling your grain is really tough. And as a lot of your listeners know who grew up in agriculture, you grow up with it at the table. You don't get a regular salary and things like that. So it's a different life, but it's been a good run. It's fun, and it's a good fraternity to be a part of.
And one thing, Jess, I wanted to talk to you about. I know farming's a tough job, but I thought you got hit with one of the toughest jobs I've seen on live television, having to rank the best high school basketball teams in Indiana, man. What kind of challenge was that for you? Because we were talking earlier, we could have 10 different conversations with 10 different people and probably get 10 different teams. So how did you go about making that list? And I was impressed with your knowledge there.
Hey, I've never had more Twitter response in my life, right? and I was expecting a lot because it's Indiana, and if you know Indiana, what's the saying? Like in 49 other states, it's just basketball, right? If I grew up going to the Indianapolis 500. My uncle Larry Hentz and Ann Hentz lived in Indy, and so we went out there every Memorial Day weekend. I'm gonna guess I probably went 10 times when I was a kid in those impressionable years. And my uncle Larry was a big Indiana fan, even though he grew up in Iowa. That was the glory days. That was 80s, 1980s with the Isaiah Thomas, then in through Steve Alford. Then I played obviously in the early 90s against Alan Henderson and David Bailey. So my uncle was always filling me in with these Hoosier stories. And I followed Indiana high school basketball through Basketball Times, through Street and Smith. And he would make comments. My aunt and uncle would make comments like, yeah, there were 25,000 people at Damon Bailey's sectional the other night or something. I said 25,000? Like in Iowa, there are maybe 2,500 at the biggest game of the year, right? So as I really fell in love with the Hoosier hysteria, then I was trying to think of this the other day. He took me to one of the state championship games. I'm going to guess it was 92. Chad Austin. I'm pretty sure that was the game I was at for the afternoon semifinal. And if I remember right, they played two games in the same day, right? They played the semis during the single class at the Hoosier Dome. So once you go to one of those, and I could talk to you guys about that forever, but once you go to one of this is not normal. The Steve Alford in Newcastle, right? We were talking about on the air the other night. Bart Fox was the producer. He's a 1990, I believe, Indiana grad from the School of Journalism. So he produced the game. So that's why we got to rolling with this. And I think Steve Alford they sold more tickets to his high school games than the Pacers did that year, back when the Pacers weren't any good. So, yeah, Coach Woods and I talked about this the last two games, and he's just huge on Christmas because of Oscar, and his mom graduated from that high school. But then Indianapolis wash was just McGinnis and Dowling, right? He just didn't think – I think McGinnis averaged 37 points a game over his last 4 games in the Indiana State Championships. And then what do you do with Oden and Conley, right? Like, not a single class, but what do you – number 1 pick in the draft and an NBA All-Star, and obviously if Oden doesn't get hurt. And then the region, right? The guys up at the region think they got the best team ever. And Don Fisher, that's the first team he mentioned as well. And then he knew every person in their lineup, including the guys coming off the bench the other night when I talked to him about it. So anyway, that's how it got rolling. It was just a blast to talk about it.
East Chicago, Washington beat my high school in the Final Four.
Say that again.
My high school lost to East Chicago, Washington in the Final Four. There were probably 10 NCAA Division I players in that game.
Yeah, that's crazy. They had Stoddard, right? And then they had was it
Junior Bridgman? Junior Bridgman went to Louisville and played in the NBA. Of course, Pete Turgovich played for UCLA, amongst others. I can't remember the other ones. So, but just great. I said earlier, I'd love to see a tournament between the Oscar Robertson's team, the 69, 70, 71 champs, the Oden and Conley teams, the Jay Edwards, Lyndon Jones teams.
Oh, Marion.
I'm like, oh God, can you imagine a tournament with those teams? It just, I was fortunate enough to be at the Hoosier Dome when Damon Bailey won his state championship. Which that was a pretty amazing event, with 41,000 people there. But I missed the Hoosier Dome. That was a cool place to be.
Let me ask you this: from an outsider's perspective, it just I can't believe they gave up the single class. Right? I understand the politics of it. I understand the parts. I get that, but from an outsider, I kind of stopped paying attention once that stopped. What's it like on the ground there? And was that a good decision looking back, or has that just been give me a do-over?
For me personally, no. But I'm not. I went to Floyd Central High School, which was a bigger high school. I understand if you're at a small high school, but you know what? If you work for a small company and big companies are going to beat you, so it's just that's life. But I think it depends on who you talk to. I would rather seen it stay single class basketball. I think a lot of people think that, but there's a lot of people that think the other way probably.
I think for me, I grew up in a small farming community in Indiana, in northern Indiana, and went to a small school. It was like 110 were in my graduating class, right? And so when I was young, we had the single class system, and it was actually teams in your community. We were one of the smaller teams in our sectional, and I can tell you that we won a sectional one year and beat our big rival, which was one of the biggest schools in the area. And there was more gratification in that than when we won a state title through the class system. I mean, it's just it to me, it took away some of those rivalries, because you play the big city team in the regular season, and then you get another shot at them in the tournament. And there was nothing greater than having those opportunities and playing that Cinderella role. Maybe it wasn't the same for guys who attended those 4A, 5A, 6A schools, but for me, in attending the smaller schools, I thought it was always more fun. Were you going to win very often? No, but when you did, I mean, it was like winning the Rose Bowl, man. It was just an awesome feeling to have those. So I wish it was still single A, but I understand why they did go to the class system.
The one thing that I don't think anyone anticipated back when they made those decisions was the emergence of the 3-point line and the analytics of that line. And I do think with the elite shooters in the state of Indiana, there would have been several small schools over the last 20 years make it to the Final Four and to the championship game, because even if you take somebody like the Big Dog or Alan Henderson, and as dominant as those guys were in the 90s, or even Oden Conley, you take 3 elite shooters from a small rural Indiana town, they'll shoot them out of those games in a one and done. Right. And that was not anticipated, that teams would come out and shoot 35 to 43s. That probably would have leveled the playing field. Obviously, you're going to always have the advantage if you have the 5-star guys, and the bigger city schools do. But that was such a unique, rare deal in the country that when you give those things up and become ordinary, from an outsider's perspective, it just loses its luster.
And let me weigh in one more thing on this too, because I remember growing up when we did have the single class system, and it was Logan Sport, so a 4A school. They played a school called Pioneer, which was a 1A, one of the smallest in the state. And one of the things that was always interesting when you got to the tournament was you would see different styles, different schemes, different mindsets, right? And I remember the Pioneer held the ball so much in that game. The final score was Logan Sport ended up beating them, but it was like 16-14. Yeah. So it was doing it's not the best basketball. It's not the most enjoyable to spend $5 on a ticket for, right? But the scouting, just the things that went into it to try to win a basketball game. And I don't think, maybe you still see it a little bit with this class system, but it was just so fun because you would see coaches pulling out the hair, doing anything possible. If that meant holding the ball for 28 minutes in a 32-minute game, by God, they were going to do it. And that's, I think, what made it so fun too.
Wow. You mentioned playing in the early 90s, Jess. You were at Iowa Mr. Basketball in 93. Looking at some of the offers, Michigan State, Iowa State, Florida State, Notre Dame, all the time you spent in Indiana, was there ever what was the recruiting talk there? Any interest there? Because I know there's Brody Boyd, who went from here to Iowa. I think that was in early 2000s. Maybe I forget when that was. But anyway, was there any recruiting interest between you and Indiana at that time?
You know what? When I was at the Nike camp, and I'm going to say 1992, I briefly talked to Ron Felling. Just briefly, you weren't supposed to talk more than 30 seconds or whatever the rules were. But Ron Felling liked me. Dan Dockich really liked me. And has made that clear, and Dan's even thrown some tweets out about that. But it was going to be hard to get me out of the state of Iowa, and it was going to be really hard. I grew up. Our farms here are 35 miles from the University of Iowa. That's where we grew up going, and family members have played there over the years. So as another Big Ten school, you get 2 or 3 scholarships. You have to say, hey, are these guys really serious or not? I've always told people I would have. I had this conversation with Dane Fife a few years ago. I think I would have had a really, really hard time playing for Coach Knight that first year. It would have been tough for me to be away from home. It took me a year to adjust, even being as close to my folks' house as I was that first year. I feel like after that, it would have been no problem. I could have been a warrior for those guys. I would have fit in well. And Dane said I would have fit in well there. But I think realistically from the beginning, Michigan State, Indiana, I visited Notre Dame, those places, I wanted to go to Iowa. And you have to make a business decision if there are those schools. Do you really want to put 2 years into a kid you're probably not going to get?